Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Show where those countries are at right now. So again, here's the Newbie 7 as a snapshot of this morning with their behavior modes of their growth. Again, the Newbie 7 are the 7 countries I forecast that some of which, not all of which, but some of which would struggle with this because of they didn't have adequate resources for testing and healthcare infrastructure. They had ongoing insurgencies in their borders like Ukraine that would make responses difficult. They have authoritarian or populist governments that wouldn't take it seriously. And here we are now, mid to late May, and all 7 of these are struggling with varying sizes of outbreaks, but none of them have contained the outbreak. Probably the one that's doing the best, surprisingly, is Nigeria. African countries, a lot of people forget that pandemics have been rife in African countries for more frequently with more recent experience. You have Ebola, but you also have outbreaks of measles and things like that. So in some ways, a lot of the sub-Saharan and Central African countries are dealing with the COVID-19 a lot more seriously and effectively because they know what the consequence can be. Now, with Nigeria, we don't know if that low number is a testing, that they don't have adequate resources to testing. Ukraine was doing pretty well, but there are about 20,000 cases. That's not too bad relative to the other ones we're going to talk about. But some of Egypt as well, we don't know if Egypt, how accurate. But what it leaves there is the 4 of the Newbie 7, Bangladesh, Brazil, India, and Russia. And I want to pay special attention to these because these countries are really in a bad shape. And I want to start with Brazil, that President Bolsonaro, sort of a populist leader, very similar in a lot of behaviors and mannerisms to President Trump, for months ignored that this, even longer than the US, Brazil did not take any proactive actions to deal with one of the pandemic responses. They have effectively been business as usual throughout this entire time, just now beginning to implement restrictive movement orders. And a lot of it's been the resistance from President Bolsonaro, who has been refusing. Well, they now have 233,000 cases. So you think about where the US was in March when I talked about tipping over, we were at 200,000 cases and we were doubling. Brazil's in the same spot. Look at this behavior mode. They're going vertically straight up. So this is nowhere near contained in Brazil, and they have close to 30,000 deaths now. And the problem with Brazil is it doesn't have, in a lot of places like the favelas, where a favela is sort of a urban district of highly dense population, lower income, inadequate running water, very close housing conditions. And we know these are where the COVID can spread very rapidly. So they're going to really struggle, I think, to contain this. It would have been hard even had they acted quickly, but because President Bolsonaro acted slowly, and it's not like it's a consensus now. There's still struggles even today with the government of how to respond. You see resignations of healthcare and ministers. The other big one, the other one of the 3, Russia, has 272,000 cases. So they have more cases than Brazil. There's been, the problem with Russia is their death rate is so low, and I'll show this on a chart that's coming up, that it's kind of hard to believe that Russia is giving accurate numbers. All of these countries, to one degree or another, we have a hard time trusting their data because either they don't have the testing sufficiency or the government is playing fiddlywinks with the number. Bangladesh and India, these countries claim to have no cases for a very long time, which was odd because Pakistan had an outbreak. You have China that has an outbreak. These are surrounding the countries. The region has an outbreak, but India and Bangladesh for a long time. You can see here, especially in Bangladesh, almost a flat line all the way through April, and then it takes off. Well, as Sabina might be saying right now in the comments, that probably wasn't true. It was probably there already, but they weren't catching it. And now they have very serious outbreaks that are growing pretty quickly. We think in Bangladesh, there's a lot more than being reported, and same with India. And they're both dealing now with the aftermath of the cyclone. But it's not just these 7 that are struggling. I was really surprised when I looked in to see that the Middle East, so I picked here some of the Middle East countries around the Persian Gulf. We knew that Iran was bad earlier, but it had a decline. I've talked about the double hump formation. You can see that in the double hump here. Iran goes up, hits a peak, has a nice decline, they reopen, and that double hump is beginning to form. In Iraq, you have it even more severely. You can clearly see this double hump. Now, their cases are low in Iraq, but that's because testing, we'll talk about Iraq later with the problems they've had with the stability in the country, it's very hard to test in Iraq. So these numbers, you got to take them with a grain of salt. The GCC, the Gulf Community Cooperation Council, they're not all listed here. Kuwait and Oman are missing, but Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Bahrain, you can see, again, much like Bangladesh, they were low and flat early on in the outbreaks. They seem to be doing pretty well, but as Ramadan began and they began they didn't really deal with their migrant workers well. A lot of these economies rely on migrant workers from Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, sort of the sub-Indian subcontinent, coming over and helping, and these migrant workers are a key part of the economy. Well, a lot of these outbreaks now are spreading through white migrant worker communities in the Gulf Cooperation Council. And there's the Qatar, just again, much like Brazil, just today began implementing more restrictive options. So I think they kind of missed, much like Singapore did, they were doing extensive testing for the citizens and the healthcare, but they were overlooking their migrant communities that ended up being reservoirs for this virus. And these two regions, or this Newbie 7 in the Middle East, represent how this pandemic, we talk about the hammer and the dance, we talk about countries being successful. This is by no means over. This is not something that's going to be eliminated or gone just because Eastern Europe and Western Europe are calming down, South Asia and East Asia are calming down. We still are seeing outbreaks, large outbreaks in the Middle East. South America is having a huge outbreak. Brazil is just the tip over there. The Ecuador, Chile, Peru, they're all struggling as well. So it's really important as we focus on the US and say, how are we doing, what's going on? There's a global pandemic underway and it's getting worse. I'm not going to say whether the US will end up being the worst of all the countries. We certainly have a good head start given what we've done or not done. But Brazil, Russia, India, Bangladesh, all of these countries are large enough, have a big enough population, and are struggling enough that they may end up overtaking the US over time. And I had mentioned before sort of how you would, monkey business with numbers. Everyone's talking about data and making, playing loose with the data. Well, you can kind of tell that in the behavior modes. It's one thing to say that someone's manipulating the data, but it's another thing to be able to see it in these behavior modes. And so what I did is I pulled up just a few charts, and these are the InfoMullet charts. Again, for orientation, it's a logarithmic scale on the left of total cases, days since first calculated infection. And what we've got here is the number of deaths in blue, the number of confirmed cases in light blue, and then our calculation of total cases, and then the three scenarios. And again, when it gets really high here, over 1 million, it looks like it's flattening out, but keep in mind, these are logarithmic. So the difference between halfway up this chart is not halfway to the top. It's 100,000. I mean, it's a 1,000 to 10 million is a large distance. So as these get higher, they look like they're flattening, but they're still growing. This is Brazil. And I'm using Brazil because this actually is what it looks like when you have semi-legitimate data. I'm not saying they're capturing all the cases, but you have a death rate, you have a confirmed rate, and you have your forecasts are higher than your confirmed. But let's take a look here at some other countries. This is Bangladesh, right? Bangladesh has the confirmed cases actually going up, crossing the forecast, right? This is something that I had mentioned before with like Norway and Finland and Germany. If you have really good testing, robust testing, and you've got a robust healthcare, so you're bringing all those people in and no one's dying, you may see a pattern like this. But I don't think that's the case in Bangladesh. You've got a very low death rate, and what that's doing is pushing the confirmed cases higher than our forecast. And this is a signal, I would say, looking at this as an analyst, that either there's massive underreporting of deaths or someone's playing loose with the numbers. And so this behavior mode here, and again, you can get all these charts at the InfoMullet, you can pull them for yourself. We posted them before for the links, but you can go on the InfoMullet and pull down any country to look at this, or any state. Here's Russia. Russia's even worse. Russia has, the confirmed cases have now exceeded the forecast. And the reason that's driving that is because the death report is very low. Russia's saying that for close to 230 to 270,000 cases, they've only had about 5,000 deaths, 6,000 deaths. That seems very unlikely. And it's probably what's going on is Putin and his regime are suppressing the death counts to make it look like it's not as bad as it seems. And again, this is a pattern you would look at and say, okay, they're probably monkeying with the data. This is another way to see data manipulation. These are all of the Newbie 7. This is the crude fatality rate. and the crude fatality rate is the number of deaths over the number of infected. And over time, we talked about the death fishhook. Most countries go down a little bit, then fishhook up, but all of these ones are kind of wacky. You've got Brazil actually looks like, it's got an increasing crude fatality rate. That looks mostly legitimate. Again, Brazil's the only one whose numbers I kind of trust right now. You have this behavior here with Bangladesh. This is so bizarre. I've looked at 160 countries a lot of times. I have never seen a crude fatality rate do this. It starts up at 9% and then just drops. Like they had solved coronavirus and no one was dying anymore. So this is what it looks like, honestly. If you stop reporting deaths, this is what your crude fatality rate would look like, because you're accumulating cases, but your death rate stays flat. So your percentage drops in a curve and ends up flattening out. And then look down here, Russia. Russia has the lowest crude fatality rate of the entire world at slightly less than 1%. So good job, Russia. Don't know if I necessarily believe that, but that's what the numbers report. So again, when people talk about data manipulation, manipulating data successfully in a highly fluid and dynamic environment like this and getting it to look right is really tricky. You're going to have these weird behaviors crop up that don't appear like anything else we've seen, and it's going to be a pretty big indication that either, again, I'm not trying to say someone's intentionally manipulating the numbers. It's surely possible, highly likely in some of these countries, but it could also be underreporting, insufficient testing, things like that. So let's see. Do a quick check on how we're doing. Catch up with some of the hellos. We got Dill, good to see you. Jules, thanks for joining. Ken, good to see you. Chris, Tyler, Rachel and Tyler, good to see you. Abu, thanks for joining. Christine Acker. Tyson, shout out to Ankeny. Dominic, good to see you. Dominique, excuse me. Wolde Jan, Sinead. Yeah, and John points out the GCC is simply getting hotter and people are congregating more in air conditioning. This is one reason I use the Middle East. There's this theory that COVID will go away in the United States when it's hot and or humid. I don't know if you've ever been to Kuwait or Eastern Saudi Arabia or anywhere on the Persian Gulf. It's plenty hot and often really humid, and you have these large outbreaks occurring. So I think the theory that, again, Brazil is not a chilly climate. A lot of these countries that we're seeing outbreaks in are the kind of hot, humid places that we're kind of betting in the US are going to decrease our case count over summer. There's no indication that that seems to be as much of a factor as people hope. Jennifer, good to see you. Barbara, shout out to Great Falls. Laura. So what are the ground effects? Tyler says, what are the ground effects for suppressing this? So obviously, in Bangladesh, for example, they're looking for praise. There's a political pressure. Banasario didn't want to look bad. There's obviously the political effect of if you suppress the numbers, the individual politicians can claim they're looking better. The ground effect, the ground truth is twofold. The first one, and we've seen this in a lot of countries, if you aren't honest in your reporting earlier, yes, you're having a lot of civilians being infected and getting exposed, but the true problem that creates is your healthcare workers, your frontline workers, your frontline responders don't know the extent of the pandemic and they don't have the proper PPE. So we saw this in Bangladesh. As this comes rolling into Bangladesh, they're reporting no cases. So healthcare workers are going about treating things. They're getting exposed, getting sick, and either being taken offline while they recover or dying. And so what happens is in the very early stage of the pandemic, when you suppress these numbers, it hits you most in the very people you're going to need later when the outbreak really hits and now you don't have the frontline healthcare workers. I think the second effect is we've seen it in the US, this kind of lingering anchor of misinformation that, oh, this isn't so bad, we'll be fine. People form impressions based off first impressions. And we're still dealing in the United States with first impressions that were wrong, that were set in place January, February, March. Well, likewise in Brazil or Bangladesh or India, Russia, I want to be clear, there's a lot of healthy skepticism in these countries for the government and the reporting. It's not like, everyone's just taking this, face value. But a lot of times these national governments are supported by very large nationalist parties. You see in India, the Hindu National Party, they are believing these numbers because it shows national pride, it shows things. That puts them exposure risk, it puts them at not practicing safe practices, and it makes the eventual outbreak not only worse in terms of containing because you have a lot of people infected and you've lost those frontline workers, but also hard to get the political consensus and support to maintain things like lockdown. So it's a very tricky. Joe, good to see you. Rory, yeah, healthcare workers were getting attacked in India. It's a very scary situation, because if you convince people that they're going to be okay, and then they have to realize they're not okay, they're often going to look for someone to blame through a conspiracy theory of why is it that this happened, because we were told it wouldn't happen. So these are good questions. So I want to take a quick circle around to from the global back to something more, let's see, here we go. Something more local in area with the United States. We'd been talking in the infomullet about the hammer and the dance, and what does it take to, the hammer is the lockdown, the dance is when you open up because you put in place testing and tracing capabilities. And everyone's been asking me for weeks, where do I go to find a state level view that's effective and objective and numeric based on how is my state doing for testing and tracing? Well, I finally found a website that does this. So on Wednesday, we showed a website that gave you every R level, R-OT level for outbreak, that tells you how fast is the pandemic growing or declining. This website, and the links again in the discussion, is a great companion, because this tells you on a state-by-state basis how ready is your state to open up. Now, little water under the bridge here, right? It's a little past, all the states are opening up anyways, but this can tell you where they prepared to open up. It's a simple color code. It's on a 6-point scale, and what they're grading here is they're grading, and I'll bring on Georgia, right? So you hover over the state, and you can see their overall grade and their testing grade, and what their current positive test rate is and the target. Now, they are very transparent. They use the same websites or the same sources we've been using, COVID tracking, and I talked about NPR. And their objective data that they use to measure is, first of all, they say the testing grade, you have to have a positive test rate under 3%. We've been talking about this since before I went in the hospital. Testing sufficiency can be equated to a low positive rate. That means you're doing enough tests, not just diagnostically of people going in the hospital, but as a surveillance purpose to know that you're finding where everyone is. If you have a high positive rate, you're only testing people who are presenting with symptoms. You're probably missing a lot of people. So a positive test rate under 3% is the best, and then they give lesser points up to that 10% threshold. Tracing, they actually use a tracing of how many tracers per daily positive case. Now, this is a new version. We talked in the past that a population-based measure is you want 15 tracers per 100,000 in normal times and about 30 tracers per 100,000 in pandemic times. This is a little bit different way of sorting that. This is saying how many tracers per positive case, which makes sense because it's the positive cases that the tracers are going to have to trace. And so this is how they rate that criteria. And again, they have a table down here where you can sort it. The final thing on this is a map is a lot of states are behind the ball on hiring tracers. So, and this was shown in NPR. What I was showing in NPR is where they were in the line if they hired everyone. This shows when the plans to hire. Green means when they've hired all the people they're planning to hire, will they have enough tracers to be ready to trace the cases they're going to need to trace? And you can see here is red is not only do they have not have enough tracers, they aren't planning to hire tracers. And government hiring takes a while. It's not fast or easy. So this is important to know that even if a state isn't ready yet, but it's planning to hire, it will probably get better. And again, this is the website's in the link. It's TestinTracecom. You can use this and look up your state to see where it's at ranking. It's objective data. I looked over it. It's basically aggregating a lot of data, but it's doing it in a nice visual. So I wanted to share this because I think between the two websites, the R-OT website that shows to what extent the pandemic's declining in your state or rising, and this website, which shows you to what extent your state is ready to go into the dance, ready to do testing and tracing. These are the two websites I would be using back and forth, and both links are in the discussion so you can see them, to see and make local decisions. You know, the infomullet, we can't update you on every single state every time. It's just impossible. But these two websites, I think, finally give us enough information to make good decisions about these whether we should go out, how we should practice safe practices. Yeah, following up on some of the comments from before, the situation in Bangladesh is getting worse and worse. I imagine that's going to be an ongoing problem because of all the countries, other than Russia, Bangladesh is reporting one of the lowest crude fatality rates. And I think someone was mentioning earlier today, Sabina was mentioning that they're using social media to report deaths. Well, it's not, people aren't unaware that the deaths are happening. They're just not being reported. And in India, Nigeria, Bangladesh, one of the real challenges, the reason they're on the Newbie 7 list is day labor is a huge part of the economies. And these folks are often hundreds of miles from their home, and they rely on the communities they're in being open for work and food. There's not a lot of, in the United States, we worry about, did we run out of toilet paper? Am I not going to get that cut of meat that I want or have to do something else? I think food supply and access to food is going to be a huge issue in India and Bangladesh with these lockdowns. So in some cases, they're not able to sustain a lockdown because you would have people starve. So this is a really tough situation to manage in the best of times, and I think it is going to get worse. Joe Hogan is asking about electoral controversy in the U.S. in November. I'm going to answer that in another time. Probably we'll do a when we do a domestic one with more domestic focus, I'll probably bring that up. It is something I've been talking about. I did a forecast on the Infomullet for instability in the U.S. and the 10-year forecast. But if we want to get something more electoral based, I'll do that coming up. Yeah, Arkansas has started free drive-through testing for anyone, no appointment, no symptoms. Do you think that is to push the number of positive tests down? Celia, yes. You want lower positive. You need to get more people. Ideally, you're testing a broad swath of the population, and people who don't even think they have it are getting tested because they may be asymptomatic. So you really need a large number of people getting tested and getting that positive rate down. Now, eventually, other countries are doing this already, but the US is so far behind the curve. We need actual sampling testing of surveillance sampling, kind of like you would put together an opinion poll and say, I'm not going to figure out where we are in presidential politics by calling 330 million people. I'm going to sample random samples that represent, and I can construct that. You're going to eventually see states start doing sampling testing where they're going out and constructing representative samples and getting those tests proactively. We're a ways from that, so at least making it more available is better. Heather, good to see you. John Palsot, good to see you. John is asking a good question that a full-blown recession depression has not been declared in the States yet. So John, the technical definition of both recession and depression are time-based. So you cannot call, these are called by the National Bureau of Economic something or other, NBRS, I think, one of those really obscure government agencies that no one cares about until they call a recession. They're the official watchdog of the recession, and a recession is defined as 2 consecutive quarters of reduced growth. So by definition, we can't formally declare a recession until end of Q3 at the earliest, which will be September timeframe. A depression is a full year of contracted growth or a year of sustained unemployment above a certain percent. So those 2 formal definitions are why you're not seeing the kind of we're in a recession or depression. In mid to late March, when I did my economic forecast, pocket full of posies, I said we're in the depression, right? I mean, I don't think there's any doubt, in my mind at least, that we're in it. We may have avoided it if we had gotten our act together early, gone in the hammer effectively, gone into the dance effectively, and exited like Germany is, or Australia, or New Zealand, or all these countries that did the hammer and the dance. They're reopening. They may have a V-shaped recession that's short. I think we have really bungled the response, and by drawing it out, I think we're in a depression. And so I think it's a semantic for a person on the street who's lost their job, whether it's formally declared or not. I'd say effectively we're in it. I don't want to get too far into the economics here because this is mainly supposed to be a foreign affairs, but Laura, I'll put that question for the next time we do the US. I did want to get to some of the foreign affairs because there is some concern. I mean, the pandemic is not the only thing out there that we need to worry about. By the way, if you haven't, follow the Infomullet page, share this video if you like what you're seeing or someone wants to see it. If you haven't supported us yet on Patreon, go check it out, www.patreon.com/Infomullet, $5 a month for a mullet-tier. We appreciate all our supporters. I did want to get into actual foreign affairs, not COVID-19 foreign affairs, but actual foreign affairs, because there's 2 things that are happening while the pandemic's rolling out that I think people aren't aware of, and they're going to get surprised by it. And the first one has to do with the civil war of Libya and Russia and Turkey's involvement in it. So we're going to kind of change streams here a little bit and go over to a map to help people get situated. Now, this is Libya. So, right, this is Libya. There we go. Get it centered here. And by way of strict, Tripoli is the capital up here. You have Benghazi over here. Sirte is in the middle. And this is in 2011, during the Arab Spring. This was the first country to go into a full-scale revolution. And what you ended up happening was you had three sides that kind of emerged as the Gaddafi regime collapsed. Now, I like Game of Thrones. I like Game of Thrones. I'm prone to make analogies for Game of Thrones because virtually everyone's seen it. You can think of Libya collapsing as like the rebellion against the Mad King. Colonel Gaddafi was the Mad King. No one seemed to like him. He was in power in Tripoli. And what happened is when he collapsed, or the government collapsed, there were three main military powers. In the western part here was the militias and fighters that came in largely from the hill areas on the border of Tunisia. They drove into Tripoli, and they sort of, they were the main movers that took Tripoli back. On the eastern side, you had Benghazi and Tobruk. This is where you had a lot of opposition early at Misrata. A lot of early opposition under, because they're distant, they were able to militarize quickly. And then in between them, you ended up having this area that ended up being actually occupied in some degrees by a lot of the Salifi Takfiri militias. So you had two non-state actors that were, if you wanted to sort of describe them, they're sort of non-state actor militias that the U.S. was supporting in our air war, and then rising here in the vacuum in the middle were some sort of more Salifi Takfiri. We're talking Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, ISIS affiliated groups. This, after the Libyan Civil War, there was a period where the government seemed to be unified under one regime until about 2014, and then it broke apart. And I'm going to fast forward a bit because I don't want to take an hour on this, but it kind of broke apart in these three signs or sectors. It broke apart. The parliament and the UN recognized government stayed here in Tripoli with what's called the Government National Accord, GNA. Over here is the House of Representatives and what's called the Libyan National Army, led by a gentleman named as General Haftar or Haftar. And in the middle, again, were these Islamic fighters that were sort of like Al-Qaeda affiliated, AQIM, ISIS, JNM, those types of folks. And they began fighting in 2014 and have been fighting since then. Now, for anyone who knows Libya, the traditional fighting is almost always along these coastlines. It's very back and forth, east to west. And that's because this entire area down here is the Sahara. You can go back to World War II and look at Rommel, the campaigns. It's almost always back and forth. So you end up getting a lot of stalemates. And that was the nature from 2014 till about 2019, where what happened is the forces in the east, the LNA, Libyan National, ended up collapsing the non-state actors. The sort of, ISIS had a little presence there. They got hammered by the US. No one wanted to support them, so they went away pretty quickly. But a lot of those other sort of Islamic Salifi Takfiri ones evaporated. And now you had a setup going into 2019 that was looking like they were going to try and make a accord, a national government. And then General Haftar pulled a pretty interesting move, is that rather than use this east-west fight, he went south, west, and north, and came up on Tripoli from the south. And this began the siege of Tripoli, which has been going on for over a year now. And once all the Western forces had to retreat, he basically expanded and was able to pretty much expand westwards. So now what it looks like is, if you clear the board, right now, the remaining areas, there's a little area of this area right up in here is what's remaining of the UN recognized government. They still have Tripoli, but the vast majority of the rest of this space is now under ostensibly the control, of the LNA, and they have had a huge swath of territory. So this brought in January, it brought in Turkey. Turkey backed the Tripoli government. They decided to support the Tripoli government with arms and weapons. And the General Haftar has always suspected to be supported by the United Arab Emirates. And in January, when Turkey moved in, Russia moved in as well. It's not really clear who began first, but Russia began backing the Libyan National Army. And what you got was an extension of a proxy war between Turkey and Russia. And for those who have followed the Infomult, they know that this is not the first time that this has happened this year. If you go over here to Syria, we already had a proxy fight between Turkey and Russia via the Syrian regime in February and March. They got into a shooting war, and Turkey pretty much spanked Russia and Syria and got them to back down. A ceasefire was declared. Turkey took a northern slice of northwestern Syria in the province of Idlib. And now it seems that we're having another situation in Libya where Turkey and Russia, again, are backing the main combatants. And this is really important because you talk about what's the strategic context. Well, right, this is the Mediterranean Sea. You've got, if Turkey's establishing a military base over here, if Turkey begins creating a sort of if they get a military presence up in here and are able to establish that and maintain that, that's nowhere near, I mean, it's across the Mediterranean Sea, but that's nowhere near their traditional zone of influence in the east. They've also now managed to take parts of Syria. And what they're doing by doing that, they're blocking Russia. There's also another complexity here in that if you look at international water lines, this area is claimed by Israel and Cypriot. Turkey's trying to claim the rest. They're trying to box out Turkey from the Mediterranean. Well, Turkey's just saying, fine, I'm going to do an end run around you and end up taking this entire swath of the Mediterranean. You're right across from Italy. Russia, of course, is trying to get some sort of face-saving influence. They've been backed down in Syria by Turkey. They're trying to go into Libya to back General Haftar and support him because they want to have access to the oil fields in Libya. Well, the problem is that I don't think Russia has the means to stop Turkey. You'll see reports that Russia is sending MiG fighters. These MiGs that they're sending into Libya, they're older, they're 1970s MiG-29, some Sukhus. These are older planes. Turkey is sending modern drones. And they're also sending air defense systems. And we've seen in Syria that the Turkish air defense systems are, whether they're in the hands of rebels or Turkish regular forces, are more than capable of shooting down Russian-created planes, whether they're flown by Russians or flown by Syrians. So I think when you hear about Libya, you're going to see this kind of increasing tension between Russia and Turkey came to the fore. It just burst out this week when there was rumors that Russia was sending planes and Turkey was getting involved. They have declared a ceasefire, but again, like Syria, I think this is another proxy conflict. And what it means is that Turkey increasingly is becoming its own regional hegemon. It's basically declaring that its sphere of influence is the entire Eastern Mediterranean and Syria. And that's a big change, not just for Russia, but for Israel, for the European Union. You know, Italy's struggling with the COVID-19 response. They were absolutely shellacked. Europe is struggling with the COVID-19 response. The question is, if Turkey wants to establish a permanent military presence in Libya, who's going to stop them? And I don't think Russia is going to stop them. I don't think the U.S. wants to stop them. And this may change the calculus in the matter. Now, everyone always says whenever Russia gets involved in anything, they say, oh, it's World War III. And what do we say in the Infomullet when someone says it's World War III? It's not World War III, okay? It's not going to be it. But you're going to see this come up more and more. And you're going to see this escalation. But I don't think the escalation is going to go that far because the Russian forces that are in Libya, they're the Wagner mercenary group. This is the same mercenary group that was in Syria, and there was a battle between the U.S. and this mercenary group that got absolutely devastated. The Wagner mercenary group has not been able to be effective while deployed. And so it's kind of like Wagner mercenary group is kind of like the Russian Blackwater. That's who's in Libya. I don't think they're going to be very effective. I don't think Russia's sending the kind of hardware to really change it, but it may be enough to help General Haftar hold on, give him some power for negotiation. So it's going to be something that we're going to have to keep an eye on. John's asking about Turkey's NATO status is problematic. It is definitely problematic because Turkey hasn't really been acting like an ally from NATO since President Erdogan went in about 2003. Now, people worry about Article 5. Article 5 in NATO is if a NATO ally is attacked, NATO has to join. And people have asked, well, if Russia attacks Turkey in Libya or Syria, are we in a war? No. Article 5 is limited to the territory that was held by the Allies at the end of World War II or attacks inside your own territory. So if Turkey gets adventurous in Libya and they get attacked by Russia or Egypt, for example, may intervene, it's not going to be a NATO situation where we have to intervene. It is definitely going to be problematic. Is it possible for Libya, Rory is asking, is it possible for Libya to become Turkey's Vietnam? That's a good question. The nature of Libya with this east-west sort of northern coastline. That's where all the freeways are. That's where all the towns are. Haftar did an interesting move by going around the bottom and coming up, but you have extended supply lines. You may not be able to hold it. The very nature of Libya's geography and terrain favors stalemates. And those stalemates have been why there's been a civil war for so long without anyone, because you can go down a freeway a little bit, but you can't really maneuver around them very effectively. You're stuck to the freeways on the northern side of the coastline. So it's a country designed for stalemate. However, the forces that are fighting generally are using Libyan cast-off military equipment that they seized from Gaddafi. Again, there's some reports of the UAE and Russia providing arms and munitions, but these are not highly advanced forces that they're fighting with. To the extent Turkey brings in high technical military equipment, as they did in Syria, that's going to prove a very decisive advantage. Remember, lightly armed light infantry Syrian Kurdish fighters, not Kurdish fighters, excuse me, local Idlib fighters backed by Turkey were able to stand down the Russian and Syria defense forces. So there's a precedent of Turkey being able to provide, kind of like the US does, very high-tech equipment into an environment that can tip the balance. Now, you saw on the map that most of the terrain is still held by General Haftar. So the question is, how far is he going to have to fall back? How far is he going to have to retreat? Is he going to be on the run, or is he going to be able to consolidate? There may be a room for political negotiated settlement, but I think Turkey's willing to take this risk because for them, they're trying to create a regional hegemon where they operate, and they want Libya's oil access. They want a base in Libya where they can operate from that gives them influence in the Mediterranean. The strategic calculus for Turkey is a lot more important than the strategic calculus for Russia, which is way out of its zone and sort of throwing some weak equipment. So I don't see, unless someone really steps up for General Haftar, it's going to be hard for them to resist, and we'll see how that plays out. Yeah, Sabina points out nobody trusts Haftar. Haftar has fought against like every country in Northern Africa and fought for every country in Northern Africa. So he's a powerful warlord. He's got a strong reputation for battle, and but he's also 70-something years old. So I don't think anyone's gonna. Groups that back him are probably doing it for other reasons. Rory's asking, does Turkey have GDP to support a drawn-out military conflict? If they're supplying arms and equipment, yes. Again, this isn't a heavy. We think of Vietnam. But Vietnam had hundreds of thousands of US troops deployed, right? In any conflict, when you talk about what's the cost, it's personnel deployment drives the huge cost. Supplying weapons and arms is, I'm not saying it's a minor thing or should be discounted, but it's a much easier fight to sustain if you are arming and equipping local fighters who themselves are bearing the weight of the cost of the conflict. And so I think in this case, you see Turkey doing, and again, they armed the fighters in Idlib. They only got involved when it looked like there was going to be, when their observers were getting attacked, when the refugees were being pushed. They only intervened in Syria. They did send in armed Turkish regulars, and that, of course, was an intervention. But Russia backed down very quickly, and I think Russia's going to probably not fare as well again this time. My biggest thing with Turkey's economy is the authoritarian rule is never good for economy, and they're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. They're not dealing with it as poorly as Russia. Again, I don't think, from a macro standpoint, I don't think the outlook for Turkey's economy is good, but I don't think the intervention in Libya is enough to, from a cost perspective, they're spending a lot more in Syria. So I think that Libya is not going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, but an overall accumulation could cause Turkey. And remember, these foreign adventurous things can go on for years, even though they can't be supported. Iran arguably couldn't support General Soleimani's adventures in Yemen and kind of the Bulls of the Horn trying to surround Saudi Arabia, where he was trying to surround the GCC. He went in through northern Iraq. He got heavily involved in Syria. That existed for years before he was killed, and that whole thing began falling apart. So even countries that can't economically support it are often able to sustain military adventures abroad for years longer than it would seem that they're possibly able to. So quick change, also local to the Middle East, but a little bit more east, is I wanted to talk about ISIS reemerging, not reemerging, they've always been there, ISIS regrouping in Iraq. So I'm going to, let me check the questions here because see if there's any more about Libya. There's been good discussion on Libya. Okay, no more Yeah, so it's interesting. Sabina mentions Qatar is pouring billions into Turkey. The GCC is involved in this. The GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, it's one reason I did those pandemic charts, right? Qatar is backing Turkey. The United Arab Emirates is backing, okay, let's rephrase this. Qatar's backing Turkey. Turkey's backing the UN-recognized GNA in Libya. The UAE, the United Arab Emirates, is backing General Haftar along with Russia, which is the LNA. So you've got this weird chessboard going on between GCC countries that are largely providing resources, Russia and Turkey all coming together in Libya, which, by the way, is on the other side of the Mediterranean from them, and it's somewhat out of their traditional playground. So let's talk about ISIS for a second. When we left off in ISIS, in 2016, I gave a presentation in Delft on ISIS. And what I described was what would happen if ISIS was defeated in the ongoing, now this was 2016, so it was still quite a ways off from reducing them. But I predicted that much like the Taliban, there's three stages of non-state actor conflict. You can talk about a clandestine terrorism group where they're completely hiding from the authorities and the public. They're doing suicide bombings, but they're not really influencing the local population other than through attacks. Then there's an insurgency where they have some popular support and they're really just trying to stay hidden from the government, and they're basically disrupting government functions, the ability of the government, they're denying territory. And then there's an emerging state actor, which is what ISIS became, which is where they claim the territory and begin openly ruling. Well, as we look at this, what happened to ISIS is they had some, I'm going to put up here some strongholds that were gradually sort of ground down in the final years, excuse me, undo here. There we go. Mosul and Deir ez-Zor were sort of the two last places where ISIS had strongholds, 2018, 2019. They were eventually, or in 2018, they recaptured Mosul. They were able to take Deir ez-Zor, and these went away. And what my prediction in Delft was, if you collapse ISIS in this area, it's not going to disappear. It's going to revert to a lower form. It's going to go from an emerging state actor to an insurgency to a clandestine terror. And I think in the last 2 years, ISIS has been operating in a clandestine terror. They're still conducting terror attacks around the region, but they weren't conducting an insurgency. There's been a series of actions in Iraq that have changed the landscape and allowed ISIS to reemerge. Remember, Iran was influencing Iraq through the Popular Mobilization Front. These were the militia forces backed by Iran that were very effective at fighting ISIS as part of the offensive, and they stayed intact. They stayed in Iraq and had a huge influence on the politics of Iraq, influencing it, tilting it more toward Iranian Shia or Khomeiniism versus the local rule. Then you had the protests of late 2019. These were sort of the, I mentioned the new Arab street that had protests in Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran. And in Iraq, these protesters were met by the PMF, often brutally. Thousands were killed, tens of thousands were injured. And it created this crisis in Iraq, into the middle of which the US stepped when it got attacked by rockets fired by these Popular Mobilization Forces, these Iranian-backed groups. They turned around and retaliated, killed General Soleimani. Fast forward to now, the landscape in Iraq is an absolute disaster from an instability standpoint. You have the generation, the younger generation that was protesting against the Iraqi government has sort of lost all faith in the government because they were being brutally killed. The Popular Mobilization Forces, which were providing sort of a military backbone to support that government, has largely collapsed. They're still intact, they're still moving, but they're not effectively coordinating since their leaders were killed. It wasn't just General Soleimani who was killed. The top leader of the PMF, several of his top deputies were killed in subsequent attacks. They've lost more leadership. And now on top of that, you have the pandemic. So you have a government ruling crisis. You have, there's no effective government anymore. The younger generation doesn't trust the government to the extent that it is. The militias have kind of struggled to sustain themselves. They're not trusted by anyone. And in this, ISIS has now regrouped and sort of reemerged as an insurgency. This is very important that this spring, they've shifted from clandestine terrorism, which is what they've been doing for the last 2 years, into an open insurgency once again in Iraq. So here we are, 4 years after Delft, and they're coming back. And it's not that ISIS has been gone from the world stage. They're active all over the world, but specifically in Syria and Iraq, they're coming back. And there's a series of really good articles that I've linked. That's a 4-part report describing this. And I want to just go over 2 of the key aspects of it. So, as you know, last year, al-Baghdadi was killed by the United States, the caliph, the so-called caliph of the so-called Islamic State. And this has sort of allowed a reshuffling of organization in ISIS. This is the new organization. And if this looks very bureaucratic and somewhat like you would expect a government, you've got councils and committees, and you've got general administration that does financial, they have expenses and budgets, budget preparations, cashiers, mail. I've always tried to point out that ISIS is organized like a national government. It's not necessarily effective national government, but it organizes itself like a government. It has budgets, it has accounting. I've even seen communications where an accountant's been chiding some militia warlord like, hey, you overspent your spending cap this month, turn in your receipts to justify your expenses. They are very much act like a bureaucracy, which is one reason they're very effective when they gain control of territory, because they sort of are an emerging state actor. And you've got all of these are now the new organizational functions of ISIS. This is not old ISIS, this is the new ISIS. This is formed in Iraq, and they underneath this sort of global structure are the wilayats, and the wilayats are the provinces. And I'm going to focus on the Iraq wilayat, but they also have wilayats in Afghanistan, Philippines, south of the Sahel, in Central Africa. There has just recently been announced ISIS president in Mozambique. So ISIS has these wilayats all over the world, and these act as the provinces that then feed up in this national structure. And the fact that they can have this level of sophistication means they're not living out of caves and unable to communicate. They're once again forming their organizational capability. And what they've done with this is this spring, they really began amping up their attacks. We talked about what are non-state actors going to do with the pandemic, and there was a tug and pull of whether they themselves would pull back because of fear of the pandemic or whether they would exploit the opportunities. I thought they would pull back out of fear of the pandemic. I was wrong. ISIS is definitely exploiting the pandemic in Iraq to reassert itself in insurgency. They're taking advantage of that collapsed government, the lack of trust between the locals and the government, and the sort of disintegration of the leadership of the Popular Mobilization Forces. And what they're doing is they're focusing, anyone who's served in Iraq, and we've had some people on the board who have, knows that there's a triangle of death here in the Sunni triangle of death. Tikrit, Saladin, all these areas are sort of the so-called triangle of death during the Iraq War. What ISIS has done is what's formed in what are called now the triangles of death, because apparently we're going to stick with the triangle motif. So there are certain regions that they have focused on, and they've maintained their combat, their fighting in those areas. They're not doing a widespread insurgency. They're very carefully targeting local areas that have sort of abandoned villages that they can operate in, that there's low population, low government presence. They've used those outlying areas to move in onto the larger cities, and these tend to be in Arab Sunni areas where they have more local support. Again, up in the north here, you have Kurdish Sunni. Arab Sunni is going to be in the north and western, and then the Shia, the Arab Shia, is all in the south. So you can see here, they're not trying to move in the south. They're not trying to move in the Kurdish. But let's be clear about the numbers. The estimate of ISIS fighters currently in Iraq that are active is 3,500 to 4,000. That's a brigade, right? That's a good-sized brigade that's active now fighting. They're estimated to have an additional 8,000 fighters that are inactive. It turns out that they had a lot of sleeper cells that kind of, when ISIS was rolled back into territory up into Mosul, they stayed in place in these areas and went underground. Those have been reactivated to carry out bombing attacks, ferry supplies, do reconnaissance. And so there's a large amount of sleeper ISIS now in Iraq that's been activated. And this is this isn't global pandemic level of concern, but this is the kind of thing that can come back to bite us if it's not taken care of in the next year or so. I use the example of what happened in Afghanistan. 2001, 2002, we pushed the Taliban back, we put them on the run, we removed their power. They were effectively disintegrated. They weren't gone, but they were very much on the ropes. Then 2002, 2003, we take our eye off the ball, we go to Iraq, we do a left face pivot and go engage some new place, taking all the resources, expertise, and knowledge, all the focus out of Afghanistan and shift it. About 5 years after that, the Taliban begins re-emerging as an insurgent force, and we never again control Afghanistan. We have tried with the surge that happened 2009, 2010. We've tried different strategies. Now we're basically drawing out, and we have a so-called peace deal with the Taliban. But these insurgent fighters have the ability to go underground, almost like a wildfire, or even the COVID-19, the reserves or reservoirs that we talk about. They'll go into a reservoir, they'll hide there until the heat comes off, and then they'll reemerge stronger and able. And if you don't have someone there paying attention or able to functionally stop them, they're going to reemerge again. And I think we're going to see that in ISIS over the summer. I'm not predicting a collapse of Iraq. It's possible. Iraq's in a situation where if ISIS emerges in a strong way, you may see the country collapse into factions again. I'm not saying that's certain, but it's certainly a risk now that shouldn't be overlooked. So let me go back and check for questions. More Turkey Operation KSA has boycott. Yeah, we're still going. Mike, good to see you. Great discussion on Libya in there. Michael Jackson, good to see you. I don't see any more questions, so I'm not sure if I'm missing the questions or. Okay, so we're in the Q&A time. We're at the top of the hour. I've covered all the things. Any questions you want to ask? Again, I'm going to take the domestic questions about election instability. Joe Hogan, I've got you marked. Some people have asked about economic factors in the U.S. I'll save those for a U.S.-based one. And I'm going to capture a lot of the foreign questions that came up here and put them onto future ones. So I want to see if there's any more questions that I've missed so far. I'm actually going to refresh this to make sure. Okay. Well, everyone, hopefully this was informative. I want to try and mix. There are some foreign events that are going on that we need to cover in addition to the COVID-19. So the next foreign affairs one will probably focus on China, the South Chinese Sea conflicts, and what's going on in Hong Kong. Because again, the world is moving on, even though the pandemic's happening, but we'll continue the pandemic coverage, especially as the U.S. continues to struggle. Again, if you like and follow the InfoMullet, if you want to share this, please share the video. If you want to become a Patreon supporter, please do. Stefan's asking about Ukraine, with the Ukraine conflict, the low-level insurgency there. I'll touch on that. Right now, the speculation is that because Russia's being weakened by the pandemic, it may favor actually political reconciliation in Ukraine, because Russia may not be able to. I mean, Russia's now projecting into Ukraine, Syria, and Libya at least, and with its own COVID-19 outbreak, it may not be able to. So, but before we get into that, that'll be another day. Please support the InfoMullet. Become a mulleteer. It's $5 a month. www.patreon.com/InfoMullet. Again, we do foreign affairs coverage, economic coverage, political coverage, anything where we can bring more context to the news. We try and do that. And I like this AMA format. I'm going to keep this AMA format going for a while, this video, and then we're starting to bring up the articles on the blog again now that I'm recovered. So you're going to see an article on Turkey with the background of Turkey and Russia, and you're going to see some more articles coming up on the InfoMullet. Once again, thanks everyone for the evening, your participation tonight. Hope you have a good evening. Stay inside, and if you can't, put a mask on, stay safe. It's still dangerous out there, but that'll be it for now. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.